Hello, everyone. Welcome to our podcast. I'm Emma.
And I'm Max. We're so happy you're here with us today.
Today, we're going to talk about something very important for learning English grammar. Grammar is the structure of a language. It helps us make sentences that are clear and correct.
That's right, Emma. Grammar is like the rules of a game. Imagine trying to play football without rules. It would be confusing, right?
Exactly. Good grammar helps us communicate better. It makes your sentences easier to understand. So, Max, why do you think some people find grammar difficult?
Well, I think it's because there are so many rules. Sometimes the rules can feel confusing. But here's the good news. You don't have to learn all the rules at once. You can learn them step by step.
That's a great point. Let's start with something simple. The basic sentence structure in English. A simple sentence has three main parts: subject, verb, and object.
Yes, for example, in the sentence, I eat apples. The subject is I. The verb is eat. The object is apples.
Perfect. Most English sentences follow this pattern. You can add more details, but the subject-to-verb-object rule is the foundation.
Let's try another one. She reads books. What's the subject here?
The subject is she and the verb is reads. The object is books.
Exactly. Now, Emma, let's talk about tenses. They show us when something happens past, present, or future.
Oh, tenses are super important. Let's start with the present tense because we use it all the time. A simple present tense sentence looks like this. I play football. It means I play football regularly, maybe every day or every week.
Right, and here's an important tip. When the subject is he, she, or it, you add s or s to the verb. For example, he plays football or she watches TV.
That's such a good tip, Max. But what about the past tense?
The past tense tells us something happened before now. For regular verbs, you just add ed. For example, I walked to school.
And don't forget irregular verbs. These are tricky because they don't follow the ed rule. For example, go becomes went and eat becomes ate.
Yes, irregular verbs are a bit harder, but don't worry, you can learn them with practice. Keep a list of the most common ones and review them often.
That's a great idea. Now, let's quickly mention the future tense. The future tense is used when you talk about something that will happen. You can use the word will before the verb. For example, I will travel next week.
Or you can say I am going to travel next week. Both are correct, but will is simpler for beginners.
Grammar is not just about rules. It's about how we use the language in real life. So, Max, how can people practice grammar every day?
Great question. One way is to read simple books or articles in English. Pay attention to how sentences are written. Look for the subject, verb, and object.
That's a great tip. Another way is to write short sentences about your day. For example, you can write, I wake up at 7 a.m. or eat breakfast.
Yes, and don't forget to speak. Talk to yourself in English. For example, say, I am making tea. It's okay if you make mistakes. That's how you learn.
Exactly. Mistakes are part of learning. The important thing is to keep practicing. The more you practice, the easier grammar will feel.
And it's okay to start small, learn a few rules at a time, and use them in your speaking and writing. Don't try to learn everything at once.
Yes, step by step. And remember, learning grammar doesn't have to be boring. You can play grammar games online or do fun exercises.
Absolutely. Grammar is like a puzzle. When you put the pieces together, you can create something amazing, your own sentences.
That's a great way to look at it. All right, let's move on to some more useful tips.
So, let's dive deeper into grammar. Emma, earlier we talked about tenses. Now, let's talk about something that confuses many learners: articles, a, an, and the. Of course, we use a before words that begin with a consonant sound. For example, a car or a book, we use in before words that begin with a vowel sound, like an apple or an orange.
Exactly. It's all about the sound, not just the letter. For example, we say an hour because the H in R is silent, so it starts with a vowel sound.
Great point. And what about the?
We use the when we're talking about something specific. For example, I saw cat means any cat, but I saw the cat means a specific cat that we both know about.
That's such a clear explanation. Emma, articles are tricky at first, but with practice, they'll feel more natural.
Definitely. Now, let's move on to something that learners also find challenging: plural nouns. Max, can you explain how to make nouns plural?
Sure. For most nouns, we add s to make them plural. For example, book becomes books and car becomes cars.
But some nouns are special. For example, if a word ends in bus, sh, or x, we add has instead. Like bus becomes buses and box becomes boxes.
Yes, and don't forget nouns that end in y. If there's a consonant before the y, you change the y to ies. For example, baby becomes babies.
That's a good one. But if there's a vowel before the y, you just add s, like key becomes keys.
Then we have irregular plurals. These don't follow the rules. For example, man becomes man and child becomes children.
Oh yes, irregular plurals are tricky, but you can learn them by practicing and reading. Now, Max, what about adjectives? How do we use them in sentences?
Good question. Adjectives describe nouns. They tell us more about the noun, like its color, size, or shape. For example, in a red apple, the word red is the adjective.
Right, and the cool thing about adjectives is that they don't change. Whether the noun is singular or plural, the adjective stays the same. For example, a big house or big houses.
That's true, but there's something important to remember. In English, adjectives come before the noun. In some languages, it's the opposite, but in English, we say a blue car and not a car blue.
That's a great tip. And what about when we use more than one adjective?
Good question. There's actually an order we follow in English. It's called the order of adjectives. For example, we say a big red ball and not a red big ball.
Yes, the usual order is opinion, size, age, shape, color, origin, material, purpose. But don't worry, you don't have to memorize it all at once. Just start with simple sentences and add details as you go.
Exactly. And Emma, let's talk about pronouns now. Pronouns are words like he, she, it, and they that replace nouns.
Pronouns are so useful. For example, instead of saying Emma likes coffee, you can say she likes coffee.
Right, and there are different types of pronouns. For example, subject pronouns like I, you, he, and object pronouns like me, him, her.
That's true. And don't forget possessive pronouns like mine, yours, and theirs. These show who something belongs to.
Pronouns make sentences shorter and easier to say. Imagine saying Emma gave the book to Max and Max read the book. It's much easier to say Emma gave the book to Max and he read it.
Absolutely. Pronouns are lifesavers. Now, Max, should we talk about prepositions?
Oh yes, prepositions are little words like in, on, at, and with. They show the relationship between nouns or pronouns and other words in the sentence.
For example, the book is on the table. Here, on tells us the position of the book.
Exactly. Prepositions are tricky because they often don't translate directly from other languages. For example, in English, we say good at but not good in.
Yes, prepositions are one of those things you learn best by listening and reading. The more you hear them, the easier they'll become.
That's true for all grammar, really. The more you use it, the better you'll understand it.
Absolutely. And that's why practice is so important. Don't just learn the rules, try to use them in your own sentences.
All right, let's continue. Emma, earlier we talked about prepositions, pronouns, and the order of adjectives. Now, I think we should dive into something really useful for learners: conjunctions.
Oh, yes, conjunctions are like glue. They connect words, phrases, or sentences. For example, words like and, but and because are all conjunctions.
Exactly. Let's start with and. We use it to add information. For example, I like apples and bananas. It connects to ideas.
And then there's but. It shows contrast. For example, I like apples, but I don't like bananas. It's used to show a difference between two ideas.
Another important one is because it explains the reason for something. For example, I stayed home because it was raining.
That's a good one. And don't forget or. It's used to show a choice. For example, do you want tea or coffee?
Great examples. Emma, conjunctions make sentences more interesting and help us explain our thoughts clearly.
Yes, and there are more advanced conjunctions too, like although, while, and however. But for beginners, focusing on the basics is a good start.
Exactly. Now let's move on to something that can confuse many learners: question formation.
Oh, questions are so important in English. We often use auxiliary verbs like do, does, and did to make questions. For example, do you like pizza?
Right. And when the subject is he, she, or it, we use does. For example, does she play football?
And for past tense questions, we use did. For example, did you go to school yesterday?
Exactly. And don't forget about WH questions. These are questions that start with words like what, where, when, why, and how. For example, what is your name or where do you live?
Good point. And remember, with WH questions, we also use auxiliary verbs. For example, why did you leave early?
That's right. Questions can feel tricky, but once you understand the pattern, it becomes much easier.
Yes, practice is key. Try making questions about your day. Like, what did I eat for breakfast? Or where will I go tomorrow?
Great idea. Now, Emma, let's talk about verbs and their forms. Verbs are the action words in a sentence, and they can change depending on tense and subject.
Absolutely. For example, the verb to be changes based on the subject. In the present tense, we say, I am, you are, he is, and so on.
Yes, and it changes in the past tense too. For example, I was and they were. The verb to be is special because it's irregular.
That's true. And let's not forget about modal verbs like can, will, should, and might. These are used to express ability, possibility, or advice. For example, I can swim or you should study.
Modal verbs are very useful. They don't change with the subject, which makes them easier to use. For example, you say I can, she can, and they can.
That's a great tip, Max. Now, let's discuss something very helpful for learners: sentence types.
Oh yes, there are four main types of sentences in English: statements, questions, commands, and exclamations.
Statements are the most common. They give information. For example, I am a teacher.
And questions, of course, ask for information, like, what is your name?
Commands are used to tell someone to do something. For example, close the door.
And exclamations show strong emotion. For example, wow, that's amazing.
Knowing these sentence types helps you understand and use English better.
Absolutely. Now, Emma, let's talk about punctuation. It's not grammar exactly, but it's so important for writing.
You're right. Punctuation helps us understand the meaning of a sentence. For example, a period ends a statement, a question mark ends a question, and an exclamation mark shows excitement or emotion.
And commas are used to separate ideas. For example, I bought apples, oranges, and bananas.
That's a good one. Punctuation marks like apostrophes are also important. For example, don't means do not, and Emma's book shows possession.
Punctuation is like the road signs of language. They guide the reader and make writing clearer.
That's a great way to put it. And remember, learning grammar is a journey. It's okay to make mistakes along the way.
Yes, mistakes are part of the process. The most important thing is to keep practicing, keep speaking, and keep writing.
And don't forget to listen and read. The more English you hear and see, the more natural grammar will feel.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us today.
We hope you learned a lot about grammar and feel more confident using it.
If you enjoyed this podcast, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and share it with your family and friends.
Yes, sharing helps others learn too. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Max and bye for now.